All right, I think we're live. Hello. Thanks everybody for joining us today for a discussion on the current state of data privacy and AI. My name is Ian Coe, CEO and co-founder of Tonic.ai. Tonic solves the myriad of problems that come up when you attempt to use enterprise data in technical workflows, such as software development or model training. The problems usually fall into one or more of four areas: privacy, data quality, synchronization, or normalization. Our platform takes care of all this for customers so they can focus on the goals of their project instead of making their data useful. Data privacy is a core aspect of Tonic AI's mission, and particularly in the age of generative AI, we are doubling down on our commitment to enable our customers to leverage their data for AI initiatives without compromising privacy and customer trust. LLMs and AI have introduced new vectors through which sensitive data can leak, including improper usage policies for chatbots, model memorization, LLM jailbreaking, prompt injections, vector reconstruction, and more. As generative AI applications are released into production, the importance of establishing proper controls and defense measures to protect data becomes paramount. So a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. I'm going to try to keep the discussion fairly conversational. Feel free to crack a beer, especially if those of you on the East Coast, looking at you, George and Allie. While I have some specific questions that I'll ask, I invite the panelists to jump in and freely if they have something to add. We already have gotten a ton of great questions from the registration form, and we'll do our best to touch on those throughout the discussion. As additional questions come up, feel free to drop them in the Zoom Q&A window. We'll have some time at the end to answer a few of these, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. Let's kick it off with introducing today's panel members. I'm excited to have this conversation with three experts in the field of AI and data privacy. Allie Miller is one of the world's top artificial intelligence leaders, advisors, and investors. Allie was the global head of machine learning for startups and venture capital at AWS, launching a new business line to advise the top ML researchers, founders in the world and lead the development of an AI product at IBM. Outside of work, Allie has spoken about AI around the world, drafted national AI strategies, and created over 10 guidebooks on how to incorporate AI into business. George Mathew is a managing director at Insight Partners, focusing on venture stage investments in AI, ML, analytics, and data companies. His background includes over 20 years of experience developing high-growth technology startups, most recently as CEO of Kesperi, an aerial intelligence and industrial drone analytics company. Prior to Kesperi, George was president and COO of Alteryx, where he scaled the company through its IPO and has held senior leadership positions at SAP and Salesforce.com. So I'd like to start the discussion by examining the current state of data privacy, the unique challenges organizations might encounter while working with AI systems, and how the market has innovated to address these challenges. So if the panelists want to come off mute, let's kick it off with Allie. Allie, what do you see as the most pressing data privacy challenges enterprises face today when adopting AI technologies?
Yeah. First, thank you for having me, and what a bummer that you didn't tell me to bring a beer prior to jumping on the webinar, but I'll push through.
Got to be prepared.
Exactly. Speaking of being prepared, as enterprises are thinking about LLMs, especially, I think that there's sort of two sides to it. They're thinking about the inputs that they're putting into these models and the outputs that they're getting out. On the input side, the fears that I have heard are one, that they're scared that like the actual model provider has access to their data and is somehow reading all of their prompts before they go to bed. And the second is that whatever you're putting in, whether it's a document or a spreadsheet or just the prompt itself, somehow gets exposed as part of the training data and somehow gets recombined back out to other users, potentially your competitors. On the output side, you teased out several in your intro. I think they're just worried that the output is bad in some way. They're worried that they're going to steal someone else's IP sort of accidentally. They're worried that the quality might just be bad and might not be even the correct answer. Or they're worried that there are vulnerabilities inside and that something has been poisoned. So I always kind of break down to input and output, but those are probably the top fears I hear.
As a quick follow-up, for you or anyone in the panel, how are these challenges evolving as AI systems become more sophisticated?
I can start. I mean, as systems get more sophisticated, you're going to see two things. One, companies that are using AI today are going to use it a lot more. And two, companies that are not using AI today will start using AI. And so a lot of the vulnerabilities that we're seeing today will scale. And so that's certainly a concern. The second, which I kind of want to just have everyone level set, we don't know yet. That's kind of as these models are coming out, the only people that know how the next model performs is the maker of that model. We can all have very educated guesses, but we just don't know. It's a lot of cat and mouse that we've certainly seen with GPT-3, 3.5, and 4 level models.
And one related point to that is, as we think about these models as they're continuing to evolve, how we use the models in the enterprise, particularly to bring production quality applications, is also complex, right? Because we have to think about whether we fine tune the model to make it kind of ready for that enterprise use case, or do we use a retrieval augmented generation technique, or do we use like large context windows? And so as the entire LM ops space, the large language model operation space itself is forming to enable models to come into production, there is a lot of opportunity for challenges, particularly when it comes to handling privacy preservation around the data that goes into both training the model, as well as what is the output of the models as they are in production.
So, George, kind of curious to get, an investor's perspective. What innovative solutions are you seeing in the market that are driving the field of data privacy and AI forward? And, what are you looking for in companies that are tackling these challenges?
Sure. So I try to break this down by looking at both the models that are being produced from a training standpoint, as well as what are those models doing as they're in production. And I think there's a number of areas that we can really help solve the privacy challenges that come around data that's either going into model for training purposes or coming out of the model from an inference standpoint. I think first and foremost, just when you think about privacy preservation, certainly what you've been doing at Tonic has been pretty incredible, right? Because you can now start to think through, well, how do I ensure that we get a high quality model built, but use a statistically significant synthetic data set, right? And that starts to solve for all kinds of problems where if you wanted high fidelity data, but there might be some level of privacy challenge in using that high fidelity data, well, why not use a statistically significant sample of the data that is synthetically generated that's sort of able to enable a model to still perform in a high fidelity manner. There are other cases where you just need better vaulting of data, right? So you can actually create a data vault. And certainly that's an area where one of our Insight, the other portfolio companies, Skyflow, does an incredible job of just making sure that the data that you might be storing from a PII standpoint is in a singular place. It's only through a single API. There's a specific way that the encryption keys are working so that you can actually store that data, and you have a way of being able to manage that in a live production environment. And then I think there's a lot of things to work out, particularly as the models are in production, right? When you think about the inference. So there's a fair number of situations where as a model is in production, you have to understand why did it do something, right? And so in that regard, just having better monitoring, better explainability, better bias detection in models is a pretty important element of really understanding, well, did I actually preserve the privacy of the information that's being generated by the model itself? I also think there's a very compelling area of research and software development that's happening in this space, which is all about evaluations and benchmarks. So if a model is in production and a new model is better. How do we know that without necessarily doing a vibe check? And so I'm really excited by some of the possibilities, particularly on evaluations and benchmarks that are also emerging. So it turns out like those areas that I mentioned are probably some of the most significant aspects of investment right now in the area of data privacy and AI.
Awesome. So let's assume we're all wildly successful. How do you sort of foresee these innovations influencing the broader AI ecosystem?
Yeah, I think what we're really at a precipice is just ensuring that these capabilities, as I've just described them, and probably one or two more, are just instilled into how we build AI systems at scale. And I don't think there's a universe where we're going to be able to, at least in the enterprise, build AI systems at scale, really thinking through the privacy challenges that come into both the inference on the output as well as the training of the model on the input. So I almost think of this as the natural substrate of how the next generation of AI systems are built. And it just so happens that in these pipelines, there are great privacy preservation, privacy data management solutions as part of how you're building an AI application.
Well, I think this has been a really interesting discussion around, some of the challenges, how organizations are looking at these, some of the companies starting to focus on these challenges. I'd like to steer the conversation towards really actionable steps that an organization implementing AI solutions can take to ensure that their data remains secure and private. Jumping to you, Allie, in your capacity as an AI advisor to Fortune 500 companies, what strategies have you recommended for integrating privacy measures into AI development from the start? And, how can companies ensure that these measures are effective as the AI systems continue to evolve and get even smarter?
What George and David have already brought up, I'm gonna say take into account everything that has been said, and I'll add in a couple of the points that I usually share. The first is that I think that there's this like big desire to either automate everything or defend privacy with like this complete human frontline attack. And I tell all my clients like you have to have both. Your privacy approach cannot just be human only, cannot just be AI or automation or software only. It has to be the combination of human and software. And that might actually mean that like your procurement team needs to understand what the heck AI is. And you shouldn't, you need your engineers in the room while you're doing all these decisions. So humans plus software is definitely one. Second, you had said kind of from the start, I think a lot of people believe that it starts with code. And a lot of the conversations are like, there are so many things that happen before a single line of code is written. David touched on these, but like one of the exercises that we do once we break down kind of like a software workflow is like reading the terms of service for each of those providers. You have to do it for the software, the model, and whatever cloud you're using. You have to do it for all the layers. And again, it's not super AI unique, but now you have that model layer and radial data like David was talking about. And so that might mean labeling data better ahead of time or labeling risk ahead of time. The last one, which George and I have joked about a lot, is like it's never done. All this stuff is changing all of the freaking time. And enterprise budgeting is this like perfect in a box. It's tied up as you're planning your annual budget. And as you're thinking about LLM based tasks or workflows that you're building, you have to allocate like at least an additional 20% just for maintenance and testing after the fact. If a brand new model comes out, are you going to have bandwidth, people, money, budget, whatever, to be able to test and continue to optimize? Whether it's model drift, concept drift, whatever. But it it both starts before code and ends well after the code is done.
Are there any specific pitfalls that you sort of call out to, avoid when implementing any of these strategies?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll touch on a new topic, which is just like who's in the room. Like David, when you asked him about kind of privacy protection from an engineering standpoint, the first thing he said was a legal team, general
Mhm.
counsel team. Like, I think a lot of people are afraid to invite finance or legal, or just anyone who's not an engineer into the room for fear that they'll like boycott or send it in some horrible direction. The products that I have built or the client projects that I have worked on, both of those, you are so much better off when you have the right people at the table, again, before code. Even if that means kind of like a measure twice, cut once approach.
Got it. So get the opinions, get everyone's opinion right away rather than
Get
trying to
everyone's
make
opinion
progress.
on the thing that they're supposed to give you an opinion on ahead of time. I don't care what my general counsel says about how to implement Tonic's API,
Well,
but yeah.
and in the enterprise, what I'm noticing, which is quite fascinating, is everyone actually does want to be involved and generally to learn and understand and be more curious. I've never seen general counsels be more curious about a topic in over 2 decades that they're using, elements of, say, for instance, ChatGPT in terms of their own day-to-day work, and they're like, well, how does this then apply to the rest of my enterprise? They want to know, they want to learn. And so this is a moment where I would not avoid partners to help you in your journey, particularly in getting enterprise systems into production. And that does include partners like your legal department, and they kind of want to be part of the conversation with you.
Is that just sort of a reflection of how compelling these technologies are that, folks who are traditionally kind of, you know, I don't know, it's singularly focused, but certainly uh, predisposed to mostly optimize around risk are now seeing that sort of the business potential here?
I think so. I think it's also an element of just the societal impact of what a model like the GPT-4 style of model that emerged and the chat GPT interface was able to do. I mean, grandmothers and grandfathers were able to relate to the technology. And so when you're at home and your extended family is able to relate to technology, and that's a conversation you might be having, you kind of think about how you can now apply that to the workforce. And
I
so
pro
it does become a lot easier to do that when the technology is that ubiquitous and interesting.
I also think of it, maybe this is like too nerdy or hard to show, but like I think of it as like a wave. And if you are talking about some sort of traditional software, the highest excitement for that software and the, worst part, the risk is like not that high and not that low compared to some other things. In Gen AI, LLMs, SLMs, whatever, all the space that we're talking about, the highs are very high and the lows are very low for how horrible things could go or the risk. I mean, we've all seen PR nightmares. I'm not making this up. Um, and so I think just people like don't want to live a boring day to day every single day. And this is an opportunity to like feel things. And they want to be in the room both to do all the things that George was talking about and really contribute and stay ahead and, see what the future is like. But also they're terrified of getting fired if it goes wrong. They're terrified of not having their voice in the room. So I think it's like both sides of the sine wave.
That I think that's definitely right. The potential and the risk are sort of at max. I think right now. Um, c- can you think of any examples? I mean, this is really for anyone, but examples of some companies that are really successfully navigating data privacy challenges, or how they did it if they can't be named.
I'll throw out one example. So first, I think like MasterCard has a fantastic data policy that they've shared. Microsoft has made theirs public. There's a couple like big Fortune 500 examples out there. One example that I'll give, and this is just on like internal usage, and this completely relates to David's original point, which is um, kind of like enterprise data management and who has access to what data and who's allowed to be exposed to certain data silos or whatever. This company, a very large healthcare company, basically said, hey, here are all the types of data that we deal with. And we're going to have 3 levels of AI usage and AI tools. For this level, which is the like free, you saw it on a tweet and you just want to test it out, you're only allowed to put in data XYZ, like nothing related to contracts, nothing related to code, nothing related to content, and nothing related to customers, like the 4 Cs. I didn't make that up. Someone else came up with that. That was category 1. Category 2 was like still not an owned model. And so you could put in, I think it was some things related to content, but still not customers and definitely not anything PHI. And then on the model that they actually owned, that kind of very, very, very high tier, they were able to use it with the widest scope of data, still not all, but the widest. And it was limited to a much smaller group inside the company. So, and then the process to actually get access to that was a whole thing. But I loved that, like, so much of LLM management Gen AI is about risk stratification. And that might be before code, that might be as you're thinking about use cases, or that might be how you give out tools or models to your employees. But that goes down as like a pretty good example in my head.
So, George, jumping over to you, we've obviously talked a little bit about sort of very big companies, but curious what advice you'd give to startups on embedding privacy into their AI products from the outset.
Yeah, I think there's some advantages for startups as well in this moment in time. One of the things I've noticed so far is that in certain markets where there isn't as much incumbency in particularly data, and data is such a big factor, right, to be able to train a high quality model, for instance. When there isn't as much data, a startup can actually move a little bit faster to either start that flywheel of data creation. And we certainly saw that with some of our inside portfolio companies, even of how fast they were able to enter a new market because they were basically generating data that continued to improve the model over time more effectively, where that didn't exist in the incumbency of that space. And so when we look at the enterprise versus, call it startups that might be working on, this particular area and building perhaps their own domain specific models, what we encourage is look for those moments where there isn't as much of an incumbent advantage. Ensure that you're doing it in a way where you're also bringing everyone else along for the journey, and it's not just about shipping the product alone. It's making sure that you think about the compliance, you think about the privacy around the data that's going into training the model, as well as the generation of content that comes out of a model. And in those cases, I do think that there is a compelling startup advantage by the fact that they just can simply move faster, but they do have to think about, well, is there incumbents in the space that have an inherent advantage because of their data that they can bring to the table? Or is there something that we are forgetting because we're moving quickly, that we're not kind of working through the privacy, the regulatory aspects, the sort of challenges of getting a AI system into production? And so I do think that smaller companies can move quickly. It's just you have to be also very contextually aware of what's happening around you as you're moving quickly.
Slightly nervous to ask, but I am curious what you think. How important is it for, companies to establish strong data foundations before data privacy foundations before scaling?
Well, look, I have a particular view on this. I've always said that this generation of AI-based systems that are emerging can't be really done without data, right? And that's pretty much proven out to be true, particularly when you look at the sort of emergence of the transformer architecture and LLMs. It is all highly fueled by data. And so if you think about it that way, you really can't have a true enterprise data architecture that fuels an LLM or a transformer or a domain specific model that you might be building without having a real high quality understanding of your own data privacy management and how you handle the necessary things that go into the pipelines that build your data strategy out. And so I don't think any model development for the foreseeable future particularly in the enterprise, is going to exist without having a strong understanding of what your data privacy policy is and what you are doing to handle data management in a privacy preservation oriented manner as you're building your AI systems.
That makes a lot of sense. This has been great. I think this is some really pragmatic advice that folks can hopefully take. And so, now I'd actually like to transition a little bit, from today to, looking a little bit to the future. So George is someone who is paid to think a lot about the future. Would love to, I'd love to ask you a question, which is, you've mentioned that generative AI is causing a transformative moment across industries. How do you see the future of data privacy evolving alongside the rapid adoption of generative AI technologies?
I think I alluded to it in a few of the other questions that were asked earlier, but I do think that we have to be very thoughtful. And I think a few of us all talked about this as well. When you think about as models are coming into production, and this is certainly one of the first years that models, particularly of this nature, are coming into production at scale. Up to this point, there was a fair amount of testing and trialing in the previous years, 2023 for sure. And now we're starting to see the productionization of AI systems. As we think through that productionization of AI systems and how it plays out, we're going to really have to get a lot more capable from a responsible AI standpoint. And that's a big, statement to say. And what do I mean by responsible AI? I do think about where not only the privacy preservation around, data that's being used to train a model, but what is the fidelity of the model that's being brought into production? What is the thinking on how a model is maintaining fairness and bias when it is in production? How do we think through, what happens when models can potentially be polluted by, bad actors that want to be able to take not necessarily the model down, but have the model misbehave because it's being injected with information from a reinforcement learning standpoint that could be negative to what the model was expecting to be doing in production. And how do we monitor all that as it might be happening? So I worry a lot more about the aspects of responsible AI as more and more of these models are coming into production. And I think the only way to really manage that is what Allie mentioned. It's going to be about risk mitigation. You're not going to get it all right, but if you have the right tools to be able to monitor and understand what's happening, certainly you'll be able to take corrective action when bad things happen to models as they're in production. And I think we're just going to see a lot more public incidences just because there's just a lot more models that are going to be in production that can be exploited in nefarious ways. It's now a question of how do we have the tools to manage the response when those events occur? And that's an area that I'm pretty focused on from even an investment standpoint.
Yeah. Any sense of what regulatory frameworks will play in shaping this evolution?
I don't know if Allie, you want to take that one or you want me to take it?
Okay, regulation. I've tried to read as many freaking regulation documents as possible and tried to map out what is everyone saying as the best regulation for whatever area they're in. And no matter how many of these I read, there's really three components that seem like they're in all these documents. We've touched on, I think, almost all of them. The first is definitely risk stratification, risk labeling, because in order to figure out your approach to something like the healthcare example that I was sharing, in order to figure out what tool you should use, what model you're allowed to use, whether it should be owned or not, whether it should be closed or open, whether it should be, based in the US or not, all of that is primarily based on what on earth you're trying to do. And so something like figuring out whether you should hire someone might be so risky that you're never going to do it using AI. And something like deciding whether an email is spam or not is low enough that you're like, whatever, put it into production. So risk stratification, definitely one. The others that David touched on and maybe he wants to expand on are like documentation, especially as we're talking about things like benchmarking or testing out new models. It's a huge piece just to be able to explain what you're doing as a team, let alone explaining to regulators. The third, and this is both internal and external, is transparency. Like telling your user, I've been looking at the Q&A that people have thrown in. If there's a chatbot on your website, you get to decide whether you label it as AI or not. I would definitely recommend doing that. But we're seeing all of these platforms and products now kind of come out and like they have to decide whether they're saying it publicly, this is AI or not. For the last like 3 years-ish, 3 or 4, every time people are talking about the next model, I ask, what do you think you'll be able to do with that? This has become just like a nerdy Google sheet that I keep. And I say, what do you think you're going to be able to do with that? And then I write it down. And then the new model comes out and everyone's testing and figuring stuff out. And I've looped that now 3 times. Always, there are like 10x the number of use cases that people are able to do versus what they thought they were going to do. And so even as we're talking about how to prepare for the future, or how to be an awesome startup that raises $1 bajillion from George, like your best foot forward is being able to move fast and react fast because these things are going to come out. Something is going to be new. And the people that win are the people that have been experimenting and know how to move fast. I loved David's example just about like engineering excellence internally, but all of that is for velocity.
Yeah, I would be very controversial with a number of recent founders that I've been chatting about this exact comment, Lally. And one of the things I kind of just came out and said on this is like presuming that, sort of GPT-5 style of models, right? It's not just obviously OpenAI, but Anthropic and Cohere and others build in that family of models. It could, be anywhere between, I don't know, 10 trillion to as much as like 70, 80 trillion parameters in an LLM. And to your point, the reasoning around that model is likely going to be exponentially better than any previous model. And therefore, the use cases are going to exponentially expand. So what you almost have to come to a very important conclusion on is you're going to have to be ready to throw out what you built and do it again, right? And that's because
We've lit so many sheets of paper on fire on my team. Absolutely.
Exactly, right? Because like this Boyd's law of iteration, like the only thing that's going to matter here is you can iterate fast because you're going to have to basically throw out anything you've done to fine tune a model in the previous generation as a new generation of model emerges.
The 3 things, and they all have their own privacy risks, but the 3 things that I think about a lot for model evolution is reasoning, which we're still kind of crap on. And so the next ones are going to be way better. Reasoning, tool usage, and modalities. Those are kind of the 3 that I've been thinking about. Tool usage includes agent, but I mean, that is a whole door opening for privacy issues that we don't see today at all, or in a very, very small way.
As the models get smarter, they will become tools themselves in potentially revealing identities of their training data or potentially just other nefarious activities.
George and I have different guesses for what will happen, but I think it's like somewhere in the middle, which is just like I imagine a world in which these people are spending $100 billion and raising $100 billion to build the largest model, and maybe it's 70 trillion parameters, whatever. Let's just say that latency becomes not our biggest concern. It's less about these like real-time chatbot answers. And there's a world in which you're like willing to submit something to an AI and it'll just come back to you 5 days later with like the whole thing done, whatever that means in that world. Like, how is an AI explaining, whether it's through explainability or otherwise, how is a model like breaking down all of the things that it's done, all the tools that it's set up, all the connections that it's made, all the data that it's decided to use, right? And if you're if it's powerful enough that you can leave it alone for 5 days and it does something, we don't have models like that today. And so just even the way that we're going to be talking to these talking again, I have so many air quotes on this webinar, but talking to AI models, I think is going to change.
Yeah, this kind of comes down to what Brian Christensen wrote about years ago called the alignment problem. I mean, we have a very big challenge already with the models that are coming into production. And, to the point of, Ian, the question you were asking, you can now use a model to function call. Function calling works, right? And the function calling could reach out to some other function. Well, that could be very much useful in very positive ways to be able to integrate certain things in the enterprise. It could also be used in very nefarious ways in terms of what gets introduced into a function call. So that risk exists even today. Now, imagine a world where we have to think about super alignment, right? Where a model is so powerful and so capable that we can't even think about all the permutations of what could have happened for it to derive the answer that Allie was just indicating after it goes away and works on something for 5 days. So I think this is some really interesting territory that we haven't fully even thought about as folks that are professionals in the enterprise.
The idea of these sort of long, very carefully reasoning systems, potentially with deep integrations into the physical world, obviously, poses a whole nother sort of range of threat vectors, as well as just, also obviously amazing use cases. And with that, I'd actually like to change really quick to kind of a rapid fire round, and would just love to hear from everyone, one or two generative AI use cases that they're most excited about. And then I think we'll jump to some audience questions.
Are we, should it just be Allie, George, David for each one? That's the order that's on my screen.
Yeah, I mean, if you feel inspired,
Great.
if you don't feel inspired, you can pass.
No, yeah, absolutely. If I'm not inspired by Gen AI use cases, what the hell am I doing on this webinar? I think I'm excited for personalized tutors for everyone on anything, and I'm excited for AI to talk to AI.
We alluded to this. I'm really excited for this emergence of this multi-agentic world where we're going to go into system 2 thinking. I think that is here. I don't think that is in a theater that's coming to us in the future. I believe that as we start to bring agentic frameworks into the way that these reasoning capabilities continue to evolve, the combination of those two orchestrated together will reach some profound outcomes, certainly for enterprise software and potentially for all of humanity.
So we're going to hop to some audience questions now. This is kind of an interesting one. I'm curious what everyone's thoughts are on this. Where is the most critical point to secure data? Is it generation, ingest, transport, or somewhere else?
I think with this webinar, hopefully everyone's leaving with this understanding that it's all the above, right? Because I don't think it's going to be an easy moment in time to say, hey, if we secured it at one point, say for instance, generation, therefore it's just going to be secure, period. I think we have to think about this across the entire pipeline of what it takes to build an AI system today.
So I feel like there's this like hopeful ideal of a software architecture, which is just like a straight line running across some PowerPoint slide. And even the order that you shared it in, ingestion, cleaning, whatever, into generation, at least the way that we're using AI on my team, it doesn't look like that. It is a constant ping-ponging between all these different sections. And so even if I said, oh, it starts before code, it's not really clear which one of those comes first. So even more important that every single stage is looked at with the same level of rigor, because they're always coming first and last and interchangeable.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the delta between the emergence of GPT-3 and GPT 3.5, what was like the primary improvement in the model, it wasn't actually, massive amounts of new training runs. It was RLHF, right? It was, to Allie's point, that feedback loop that came out of what the model generated, and to be able to say, well, how good was that? And the feedback loop to say thumbs up or thumbs down in this case, in terms of what the model output was fed back in to improve the model's performance. And so I do believe that, this linear notion of how we're building things in general from a software standpoint is certainly going to be completely reimagined, if not already been reimagined, with a much more iterative approach to where generative AI systems are being built today.
Absolutely. Another sort of tactical question: what are the best tools and frameworks to assess risk when using third-party AI tools?
It is pretty early because these overlapping regulatory frameworks are kind of emerging at once, and you almost kind of need a governance risk compliance system just to be able to track everything that's happening right now. And there are capabilities that are being provided. So one company that happens to be doing some good work here is called Tonic.ai. They happen to bring together all of the various regulatory changes that are occurring at any given time and providing a risk compliance system to be able to understand how those changes are occurring to help the enterprise make some decisions and apply those in their AI systems. So it's still very, very early though, because of how dynamic the entire space is right now.
+1 to both. Majority of people that I talk to look at NIST and customize. The other ones sound great, but the majority to go NIST and customize. And then to George's point, Credo also has scorecards for third parties. So they give you the framework and here's how to run your own, thing. But then they give their own scorecard. And a lot of companies are trying to do this. OpenAI has started doing it for their own models and said, GPT-4o is medium risk, and they run down a whole scorecard. Reading more scorecards is going to give you probably the best view versus just one third party or first party.
Well, as sort of a final question to this group, what is one privacy rule that everyone should follow, but most people don't?
I'll start with one that I just yelled at someone for, which is like two-factor authentication is so important. Almost no one does it. But the thing that I yelled at them for is that we have to redefine what two-factor authentication is now, that you can copy anyone's voice with one TikTok video of them. And I think it was someone I was talking to in finance. And I was like, your entire security is shot. Like, how are you redoing this? You have voice off. That is not going to work for the rest of eternity. So that's mine.
Yeah, I got a good one.
Go for it.
Yeah, don't collect and store your customer social security numbers as a starting point in a standard database without having some mechanism to be able to encrypt it or be able to keep it in some separate system that can't be necessarily cracked, which has happened many, many times now, where particularly in the B2C consumer world, just amazing how much data goes into the dark web because just data management practices aren't really that great. And when the hackers arrive, they're taking troves of information, particularly things like social security numbers, which there's no reason to be storing social security numbers these days.
Yeah, certainly timely on that one. Awesome. Well, I think we are at time. So thank you, David, Allie, and George, for the insightful discussion. As I mentioned before, data privacy is something we deeply care about at Tonic, and it was great to chat with you all about how the discipline is evolving and more and more AI technologies come to market that only complicate and make it more possible to do better. For those joining us, I'd also like to thank you for taking the time to tune in for the discussion. My hope is that you've learned a lot more about how to address the unique privacy challenges that have emerged almost as quickly as AI has evolved in the last few years. Lastly, I want to extend a special offer to those who joined today's session. Tonic works with hundreds of customers around the world solving some of today's most important AI problems. If you're getting blocked by data quality or privacy challenges for your AI project and would like to chat with someone on our AI team, feel free to sign up using the link we just dropped in the chat. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.